Hello, everybody, and welcome today to our webinar about diagnosing systemic issues in senior teams. My name is Ruth Moody, and I run Farscape Development. We are a people development consultancy. We're particularly interested in how we can help organisations and people to thrive rather than just survive. So we pay a particular attention to the behavioural choices that people are making and how their personality, values, emotions, beliefs, etc., impact and influence on their behaviours, the relationships they build, and the systems that they are part of. So today's topic, we've had a great response about. So it's obviously something that is of real interest to lots of people. And it's a really big topic. So we could spend a lot of time on the different models and tools and theories that might be helpful when considering this whole issue of diagnosing systemic issues in senior teams. So what we've done is pulled together some of the best thinking that we believe is out there based upon our own experiences of working regularly at this level. So in terms of those behavioural choices that people make, we do a lot of work one-to-one with senior leaders, but also with groups of senior leaders, intact teams, if you like, helping them to explore what are the things that are going on, the underlying things around their emotions, values, behaviours, etc., that will be impacting and influencing on any of those systemic issues that exist. So in terms of today, these are the things that we're going to be covering during the presentation. So first of all, I just want to clarify what we mean by systemic issues, because certainly through our experience of working with different organisations, we know that not everybody is clear about what this term means. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what systemic issues are and also introduce a couple of different tools that we use as almost as lenses to look at systemic issues in teams. I then want to go on to talk about difference. So systemic issues exist everywhere in organisations, but there are some things which make senior teams unique. And so why are they different and why is that important? We're then going to talk about buy-in. So why is that so important at that senior level? Because sometimes we have the challenge, well, couldn't we just let them get on with it and concentrate elsewhere? And actually, our answer to that is always no, because it's so important that we do have buy-in at that senior level. So we'll just talk a little bit about why that's important. And then pulling all of this together, what are some top tips? So some things to consider that would give you the best chance of success if you are seeking to diagnose any systemic issues that are existing at that senior level. There will be an opportunity to ask questions. So you should all be able to see a questions box on your screen. And if you type questions in there, I will make sure that I check those questions at the end and answer any that haven't been covered by the content of the presentation. So what is a system and what do we mean by systemic issues? Well, first and foremost, systems exist in all areas of life. So there are cultural systems, professional systems, systems in families, and they all create their own loyalties and different experiences of belonging. And so you start to see invisible ties, links, and loyalties developing. Systemic issues, particularly though, exist where something goes out of balance. So, if you like, the naturally occurring organizing principles need to remain in balance or they start to have a powerful impact. And you may be aware of some of those issues that exist systemically because you start to see things like difficult behaviors, dysfunctional teams, perhaps repeating patterns of behaviors that are negative or aren't constructive, and conflict. So those are all signs that something perhaps is going on at a deeper systemic level that needs to be diagnosed, needs to be worked with in order to work it out. So these problems perpetuate if these invisible issues remain unspoken about or aren't acknowledged. So crucially, I think that's a really important point. Those invisible ties, links, and loyalties do exist, but where imbalance exists, if it's not spoken about or acknowledged, that's where the biggest issues exist. Actually, where they're spoken about and acknowledged, we can do something with that, and the impact is less. So what we're going to do now is just look at a couple of different examples of ways in which you can look at and explore systemic issues at any level, but we particularly like these two routes in, these two lenses when working at a senior level, because they're a way of offering evidence and proof of some of the things that might be going on. So the first lens, the first approach is drawn from John Whittington's work on constellations. And you can see that he describes three things that should be in balance in any system. So on your screen there, you've got time, exchange, and place. So often there are issues in teams where these things are not in balance. And again, crucially, they're not acknowledged that they're out of balance. So let's start with time. So if there's an issue with time in a system, there's a lack of acknowledgement of the time served in that system and an acknowledgement of everything an individual has done to contribute to the current state. So those who join the system first need to be acknowledged before those who follow can find their place and can fully occupy their role. So an acknowledgement of who contributed first. So that might be the founders or a previous role holder. Once that acknowledgement exists, you then generate clarity, order, and the system can kind of flow in balance. So a good example of when that might go out of balance is when a new leader joins. So if they don't come in and recognize that they are last in place in the context of time, then actually they may have issues around being able to influence and have authority in the way that they need. So that acknowledgement, that recognition that they are last in place in the context of time is really important for the system to stay in balance, and also for the past to stay in the past and the future, there to be a future focus. The second point there then is exchange. So that's where an imbalance exists, where one part feels that they're putting in more than they're taking out. So there needs to be a continuous balancing of giving and receiving between all parts of a system for it to remain in balance. And what we often notice, particularly in corporate organizations, is that there's an imbalance of exchange sometimes between different parts of the system. So a good example of that would be perhaps where there have been mergers and acquisitions. And what we notice is that one party perhaps is putting in more or taking out more than the other. And often we can diagnose that as the root of problems quite a long way in the future when we come to look at it because of that imbalance in exchange. So it's really important to think about how do we make sure that that balance is maintained, particularly when you've got things like mergers and acquisitions going on. And then finally, place. So everyone has a right to belong. So people who feel misplaced create imbalance. So a good example of imbalance in terms of place could be where that right is denied by exclusion. So perhaps people have left under difficult circumstances, there may be redundancies, there may be sackings, there may be a restructure. And what we notice is that people who leave systems under difficult circumstances, not only do they leave an entanglement behind in the system that they were in, but they also take that dynamic with them into the next system. So when we're referring to systemic issues, we're often referring to these imbalances that lead to difficulties. And constellations as a tool is really powerful because it's a way of helping teams and individuals to create a living map or a sort of map out a spatial relationship model which represents all of these different facets and imbalances that might exist. And it's a way of kind of stepping back and looking at a relationship system and looking at the underlying hidden structure of a system and how you can start to bring that system back in balance a bit more. So as a tool working at a senior level, it's a really powerful one because it's slightly less threatening because you're asking people to step back and look objectively at a system rather than expose themselves within that system at that moment. So that's one tool. What I'd like to then go on to talk about is another tool which offers, we think, a different lens, and it's around structural dynamics, based upon David Cantor's work of the 4-player model. And I think this offers a really compelling insight into how teams operate. So structural dynamics is the theory of how face-to-face communication works and doesn't work in human systems. So the 4-player model that you can see on the screen here is the core concept of the theory of structural dynamics. So Cantor has researched and explained that in all interactions between people, there are 4 and only 4 possible speech acts. So he calls these acts or actions. So just talking you through the model then, starting at the top, we've got the position of the mover. So someone who takes up the mover act or position intends to bring direction, discipline, commitment, energy, inspiration, high standards to any team or group. But sometimes people can experience them as being impatient, controlling, bossy, arrogant. But the crucial thing here is that without movers, there is no direction in a group or system. Moving then round clockwise to the follower. So people who take up the follower position or speech act intends to bring completion, loyalty, service, continuity, fairness, support. But sometimes people experience them as being kind of people-pleasing, perhaps a bit indecisive, sometimes over-accommodating, weak, compliant. But without followers in a dynamic, there is no completion. moving then around again clockwise to the opposer position. So people who take up that oppose stance or speech act intend to bring challenge, courage, correction, protection, conservation, sort of survival, if you like. But sometimes people experience them as being critical, complaining, perhaps attacking, sabotaging, being disrespectful. But their crucial role is that without opposers, there's no correction in a system. And then finally, the bystander. So they intend to bring perspective, patience, wisdom, moderation, consideration. But sometimes they're experienced as being perhaps a bit disengaged, judgmental, superior, sitting on the fence, being a bit withdrawn or aloof. But without bystanders, there's no perspective. So using this model and looking at the systemic issues, problems occur when individuals become stuck and overuse one of those actions. So we all have a preference, but actually sometimes people don't recognize that they're getting stuck in one of those places and the impact that that might be having on the group. Also then in terms of a kind of group or team situation, crucially, when certain sequences of actions become entrenched, and that then starts to undermine how the group works together and makes decisions. So for example, a group could get stuck in a move follow pattern. So you've got people who are playing the moving role, they're giving direction, they're wanting to kind of move forward. The followers then want to complete, they're supporting, they're enabling. And so you get stuck in a system of moving, following, and actually there's nobody offering perspective and there's nobody offering correction. So from a decision-making point of view, the movers then start to become very powerful. The followers support their move, and actually from a group perspective, that can cause some issues around the way things are working and the way decisions are being made. So those are two, I think, really powerful lenses when looking at this whole issue of systemic issues in senior teams. So the first one, the constellations, looks at the invisible ties, links, and loyalties that exist and whether the system is in balance. And then you can add to that, layer onto that, the four-player model, which are the observable acts of communication that impact on how the system functions. So two great tools to consider using if you're working at that senior level. And David Cantor's book, Reading the Room, great book in terms of deepening your understanding of the four-player model and how you can use that to work with groups and teams. So moving on then, aren't senior teams just like all other teams? So yes and no is my answer to that. So yes, of course they are, because any team has its own set of dynamics, its own potential issues, different agendas, personalities, etc. But what we notice in terms of the work that we do is that anybody who sits in a senior team actually is in a position potentially of increased vulnerability. And what we don't know in terms of those dynamics is whether they feel psychologically safe to be vulnerable. And so it's really important when working in the senior teams to acknowledge the fact that people are potentially going to feel vulnerable. And what we might therefore see is people saving face. So rather than being willing to open up, discuss some of their potential issues, their strengths, weaknesses, challenges, the things that they might be struggling with in terms of that group dynamic, they would rather save face. And that could be caused by a number of different things. There could be some jockeying for position going on. There may be competition between different personalities in that board or in that senior team. There could be some issues around career progression and succession planning. You know, who's next to step up, who's next in line, what are the allegiances that might exist between different people. And similarly, the pressures around shareholders, private equity investors, whatever the setup of your organization is. All of those things kind of bring pressure to bear on the system that is a senior team. And I think recognizing that they are in a unique position in terms of that pressure is really important whenever you're working with them. And therefore paying attention to how you can create a space and a place that is psychologically safe for them to start to be willing to open up and explore some of those invisible ties, links, and loyalties that exist that might be out of balance, and some of those observable acts that might be happening and might become entrenched, which are affecting the way the team works. So why then do we need buy-in from senior teams? And I spent some time considering what the best route into talking about this was. And actually, I came back to Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. So I'm sure you are all aware of this model, but I think it's a really good one to kind of emphasize why it's so important. Because in any team, if there's an absence of trust, if people don't feel able to be vulnerable, you get this state where everyone's kind of protecting themselves. There's no trust that's going on, and so people aren't going to be open and talk about their fears, their issues, their challenges. You then get a fear of conflict happening. So people being unwilling to challenge, to have difficult conversations, to constructively push back sometimes. And so you tend to get this sort of sense of artificial harmony, the kind of nodding heads, smiling faces, but actually just a little bit below the surface within the system, things are not well. As a result of that, you then get a lack of commitment. People haven't felt able to challenge, haven't felt able to be open. Therefore, they don't really commit to the plans, to the things that need to happen. And so you start to get ambiguity. There's no real clarity within the team about what actually is it that we're going to do. Then you get a lack of accountability. So because people haven't had that opportunity to have their voice heard, to challenge the ambiguity that exists, people aren't then willing to be accountable or indeed to hold each other to account. And so we start to see standards slipping. And then finally, you get to the top of the pyramid, the lack of attention to team results. So people are more interested in protecting their own status and ego rather than paying attention to the team and what the team needs to achieve. And so actually, if you take that model and map that onto an organization, if the leaders, if the senior teams aren't role modeling the right behaviors, aren't willing to be open and vulnerable, to share their challenges, aren't willing to have constructive conflict, to commit to things, to hold each other to account, to pay more attention to the team than to their own status and ego, it's inevitable that you'll start to see those behaviors filtering down into the rest of the organization. And we know what a significant impact leadership style has on the culture of an organization. So actually, if the senior team doesn't buy in, there's a big question mark for us over, is your investment in development programs lower down the organization actually going to work? Because if they don't see somebody at the top role modeling these positive behaviors, they're not going to do it themselves. So I think it's just a really important point to consider that there's a temptation, and it's hugely tempting to just kind of say, okay, don't worry, we'll not do anything with the senior team, we'll focus lower down. But actually, are you limiting the success of that? And it's interesting for us because often when we're invited into organizations to work, and perhaps we've been asked to put together a leadership program for middle managers, and then the board say, is there any chance you can come and just do a quick couple of hours in the boardroom to tell us what's happening? And that for me is always a flag or a warning sign that, okay, there's probably some issues here that need to be addressed. But here and now, this senior team aren't willing to look in the mirror and look at what they need to do differently. I just thought it'd be interesting actually to see what your view is in terms of how open your senior teams would be to looking at their own behaviours and impact. So you can see that I've put a poll on the screen here. So if you just want to vote in terms of where you think your senior team would be. And certainly in our experience, there are lots of different situations and challenges that we come across in organizations. Sometimes there's a real openness to looking at their own behaviors, and sometimes there's a real sense of absolutely not, don't want to know, go and look elsewhere in the business. Okay, so we've got, can see that the figures are climbing up. We've got 55% of you who have now voted. Right, I'm going to end the voting and show you the results of that poll. So you can see there in terms of 72% of you voted in the end, and we're sort of seeing a slight skew towards closed. So the senior team perhaps are feeling a bit threatened and not wanting to look at their own behaviours and impact. Great to see that some people are really open to it. And I think in those organisations, there's real pleasure in being able to go in and push against an open door, I guess, in terms of working with those senior teams. And then they're neither open or closed. I think sometimes teams don't really know whether they're open to this until they start doing it. So really interesting to sort of see that spread of results from you there. Thank you for that. So some final considerations then in terms of working with teams at this level. So the level of psychological safety that exists within a team, within a system, is crucial. And I've touched upon that a couple of times, and some of you may be familiar with things like the fear-free organisation. So we know that in organisations where there is a real culture of fear, that you start to see people burning out, absenteeism, people going off with stress, and actually there's a huge cost to that, not only in terms of the cost to the individual, but also to the business. So what is that level of psychological safety, and how can you pay attention to creating an environment that feels as safe as possible for a senior team? So if we think back to some of those unique issues that put pressure on the dynamics of a senior team, what can you do to start to build trust with them that it's okay to be open, that it's okay to be vulnerable, and it's okay to explore some of these challenges that exist? So in terms of then appetite for change, are you noticing that there is an appetite for this? Because if there isn't, there needs to be some probably challenging conversations around why not, what perhaps needs to be done differently in order to create an appetite for change. So if it's feeling a little bit like herding cats, it may well be that they're just not in a place that they're ready to embark upon this kind of program. I think some of the things that you can do to build the appetite for change and to pay attention to the psychological safety is think about where you're having conversations, whether one-to-one or with the group. So what we notice is that there are often entrenched behaviours, negative anchors to boardrooms, to particular places where meetings take place in offices. And so actually thinking about where you can take a senior team to have these kind of conversations is a really positive way of starting to build difference and build that safety. We're real advocates of using the outdoors for this. So whether it's just going for a walk one-to-one, having a good conversation with them, or whether it is taking a group into a natural setting where they can sit and reflect and talk in a way that they wouldn't when they're in the office. There's lots of really interesting research around the impact of the natural environment on how people think and reflect, and we've got some other webinars about that that you could look at if you're interested in it. But I think what we do know is that it really helps them to let go of some of those negative anchors and start to think and behave in a different way. So really pay attention to where you're having those diagnostic conversations. I think the style of the conversations is also really important. So this is about being curious and listening, not rushing the conversations, taking a kind of coaching approach to it really, to make sure that you're teasing out and understanding the subtleties of any issues that are going on. I think there's a real temptation to rush a diagnostic and kind of get onto the doing, the delivering the change program or the delivering the leadership development. And actually, we now have learned to slow down and to recognize that this diagnostic element is almost the most important part, because if you don't get this right and if you don't really understand what's going on, then anything that you do deliver will have a limited effect anyway. So I think coaching is definitely the right style. It's a sophisticated approach. It requires somebody who is able to really hold that conversation, to ask some really good questions, and to challenge where necessary. And then it's about using appropriate tools and techniques. So there are lots and lots of things you could use, and I've certainly seen examples of where people have thrown a lot at this kind of thing, and they've created a place where there's real confusion around different models and tools. So choose carefully. So we like constellations, we like 4Player, because I think both of them allow people to step back and view things objectively. They also are a great way of providing evidence, and I think at a senior level, there is often a need for evidence that something needs to change. So choosing things which you feel are appropriate and using them well. Don't just kind of use them for half an hour and then move on to something else. And then we often will use some form of psychometric and 360 as well at a diagnosis stage. And I think we tend to move away from, particularly at a senior level, we move away from things like type psychometrics, so insights and Myers-Briggs, and move more towards trait-based psychometrics like the NEO, because that offers us a much more in-depth view of the different personality facets and can be mapped onto a 360, which then enables us to look at how is someone's personality helping and hindering them, and what are the experiences that other people are having of them and their behaviours. And that's just another lens into what might be going on at an individual level, and how can we start to tease out and understand what impact that might be having on the system, if you like. So just to kind of pull everything together then in terms of what I've covered today, please do pay attention to those unspoken invisible ties, links and loyalties that exist within the team. It's really important to just really recognise what those things are and spend time understanding where there's balance, where there's imbalance, and if there is imbalance, what are those areas that are out of balance? Is it time? Is it exchange? Is it place? Choose an appropriate environment. Make sure that you're really thinking about that. And I think if you're getting pushback from a senior team, oh, we haven't got time, actually, getting them away from emails, getting them away from interruptions and from those negative behavior patterns will pay huge dividends in terms of what you're going to get from this kind of experience. So I think really be willing to push back on that. I think recognizing also how important it is to gain buy-in. So this diagnosis stage is your opportunity to gain buy-in to any kind of development program. So doing it well and taking time over it will really pay dividends in the long run, because you'll have a really rich pot of information that you can then draw upon to shape and mold a program that's going to be right for your senior team. And then acknowledge some of those negative anchors and fears that might be getting in the way. It's really difficult sometimes for people to be open and to be willing to be vulnerable. And I think if you can acknowledge, and I think acknowledge has been a key word throughout all of this acknowledgement of imbalance, acknowledgement of negative anchors. If you can make sure that you're doing that, it supports people in terms of their fears that they may have to get to a place where they're more willing to be open and vulnerable. And then finally, I think be brave. I think challenging teams to face up to these imbalances and entrenched behaviours is really important, because sometimes it's easier for them to deny and say, oh, the problem is elsewhere. And it can be easier for people who are external to an organisation to be challenging, but certainly pushing back and not letting people and teams at that senior level get away with thinking that actually the problem exists elsewhere, because often it doesn't. So I hope that you found that a useful kind of summary and overview of what to consider when you're looking to diagnose issues in senior teams. I can see that there are a couple of questions that have come in, and there are a couple of people typing now. So there's one here around how do you measure change? It's a good question, actually, and I think the whole measurement of change in any kind of program is an interesting one. And I guess my answer is perhaps more about how do you make sure that you are clear about what it is you're measuring, because different organisations have different ways of measuring change. So, for example, setting really clear and objective outcomes for us is crucial. So what are we going to see and hear people doing and saying differently as a result of this work? Because I think you can then be really clear about what you're measuring against. So I think in terms of that measurement of change, clear and objective outcomes are crucial. I think then there's another question here. What if they don't think they're the problem? Fair one. And I think that comes back to my point about having to be brave enough to challenge. So if it's feeling like herding cats, as I said before, perhaps it's not that important. And that's the time where we perhaps need to kind of push back and find out, what's going on. And then finally, I guess using external providers in that situation can be a way of challenging them that is more comfortable and safer for you. I'm just looking here now at a couple more of the questions. We've got here, what can new leaders do when they join senior teams as a leader of those teams, which are well-meaning, but are either beleaguered by a succession of changes or have previously been dominated by a very strong, driven leader? Okay, that's a really interesting question. And I think that comes back to, first and foremost, around an acknowledgement of time in the system. And so actually investing time in talking to the team as the new leader about their position in the system, they're joining that system last, and acknowledging that. I think that's a really powerful and simple thing that new leaders can do in any team when they first join. And I think then you've mentioned a couple of things there around succession of changes. So perhaps there's an imbalance then also in terms of place and exchange. So I would always advocate spending time as a new leader with a team, starting to understand, well, actually, what are the changes that people have gone through, and how are they feeling about them? And is there an imbalance in terms of exchange? Do they feel they're putting in more than they're getting out? Do they feel that their place has disappeared? Do they understand their place? And so often those kind of conversations can be facilitated by somebody else to help a new leader in that kind of situation. But certainly paying attention to those things that may have existed in the past will pay huge dividends in terms of moving an organisation forward, or moving a team forward. Okay, I think probably we have covered all of the questions that have come through. Hang on, there's one more here. In times of change, particularly structural change, do you consider those behaviours to be amplified, particularly if people think they need to consider and act a certain way to be part of the future. I think in times of change, you do start to see behaviours being amplified. And I think it's just about understanding what's going on for individuals, and just kind of paying attention to how people are thinking and feeling, and that comes from conversations. I think if anybody would like to explore this in more detail, then I'd be very happy to have a conversation with you. I think it's a big topic, and I hope you have found it useful just considering some of the different ways in to having these kind of conversations. But thank you very much for joining us on this, hopefully wherever you are, sunny Friday, and I look forward to you joining us on a future webinar. Thank you very much. Goodbye.